Okay. Cool. Well, hello to everyone that's here already. I'm sure we'll get a few more people joining us in just a second, but for those who are here, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the main regulatory changes that apparel brands need to be aware of over the next few months in both Europe and North America. My name is Callum. I head up business development at EdgeComply. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a product compliance partner who specialize in helping brands navigate regulations and ensuring that their products are compliant for sale in the markets they sell into. So with me are my colleague Jonas from EdgeComply and also Audrey Hayworth and Lewis Collington, who are part of our expert community. Audrey is a US-based expert in the consumer products industry who covers both the US and Canada and has held multiple executive level roles such as Director of Product Safety and Compliance and Vice President of Operations. Lewis is a specialist in consumer product safety and advises brands launching products in the UK and EU markets. Previously led compliance at TK Maxx and is currently a market regulator for trading standards and a lead officer for product safety at CTSI, which is the national body for trading standards professionals. So the plan for today will be running through each of the key regulations that we're going to cover in a presentation, 5 in Europe, followed by 4 in North America. Then we'll cover off any pre-submitted questions we had. And finally, we'll open the session up to more of a live Q&A, as I'm sure as we're going through everything, more questions are inevitably going to arise. We have a fair few pre-submitted questions from some of you. So I can see questions from Samantha, Louisa, Reese, Amanda, quite a few others as well. I will be sure to get to them before the end of the session. And yeah, if any more questions do rise throughout, feel free to pop them in the chat or just use the raise hand function on Teams. But yeah, enough housekeeping. I'll pass over to Jonas to get us cracking.
Fantastic. Thanks for the intro, Callum. And yeah, hi to everybody who's already on the webinar. I'm going to skip right into the European section. As Callum said, we've got 5 different regulations that we want to get, that we want to discuss today. We're going to go from bottom to top in terms of what we think the most important are. There's a couple of factors that go into the definition of what we think is important. And the first one we're going to cover off is European PFAS restrictions. So just as a quick reminder of where PFAS is commonly found in the apparel and clothing space, you can see the most common scenarios here. So whether that's rain jackets, workwear, gloves, but also things like wrinkle-free shirts, or really any textile fabric apparel that has any moisture-related functionality. So you can see the example in the bottom left of activewear that's maybe sweat wicking or odor resistant, or the soft shell, which I would put in a similar category as the rain jacket. The tricky thing about PFAS, and we're going to talk about what PFAS actually is in a second, but the tricky thing about PFAS is that even if you don't have any intention of having PFAS in your materials, because of the manufacturing process, there's always a risk that residuals from other products that are produced in the same factory contaminate your products. And so these are the highest risk categories, but you cannot safely assume that your products are free of PFAS just because they are not in any of these categories. PFAS in itself is, as I'm sure many of you know, is a family of thousands of chemicals. So PFAS is really a generalization. And when we look at the European landscape at the moment, this becomes very apparent. So we've got this PFHXA restriction that's coming into effect in October 2026, which is specifically targeted at a subgroup of PFAS that is found to be particularly harmful. You can see for this particular, and we're going to put this in perspective in a second, but one thing to emphasize is that Europe is currently at a state where we have when we have restrictions for specific compounds, but there's no harmonized restriction across the entire PFAS family, and that makes things confusing. Two countries are leading the pack here, France and Denmark, from July, have decided to basically go ahead and implement their own strict bans, which go beyond what the EU has implemented. Lewis, one thing you always like to point out is what PPB actually stands for, because people struggle to put that in perspective, I feel.
Yeah, I love this. So parts per billion seems like a really weird concept, but if you picture an Olympic-sized swimming pool, 25 parts per billion is the same as 25 drops of something in that Olympic-sized swimming pool. So we are talking about tiny amounts, which makes it really difficult to comply with.
We'll talk about the timelines in a second. Just generally, quick refresher on why PFAS are being restricted. It's the type of chemical that's termed forever chemical or forever chemicals, which are harming the environment and our health, and that's why legislators have decided that they have to crack down, not only in Europe, also in North America. We're going to get to that later. In terms of the timeline, so the key dates that we decided to include here are the following. On the 25th of May, so surprisingly recent, and this is just coincidence, the EU has actually had a consultation on how to go about a universal PFAS ban across EU member states. The idea is to incorporate that into the REACH regulation, which obviously governs chemical restrictions across the EU far beyond PFAS. What we're expecting now is that there's going to be a publication of the results of this consultation, and there's going to be a plan laid out by the EU that provides a path towards that universal ban. And that's going to make things much easier for everybody. At the moment, what you as apparel brands have to deal with is from the 1st of July, there's a very specific threshold that's coming into effect, the 50 ppm limit in Denmark. So that's being tightened. And then from the 10th of October this year, this new EU-wide PFHXA restrictions coming into effect. Anything to add here, Lewis, before we jump ahead?
Just that on that consultation, we'll know by the end of this year what that decision is, and it's looking likely that we'll be moving towards that total PFAS ban with very limited exemptions, none of which I think are likely to apply to the fashion industry.
Now, one thing I want to add here as well is that obviously we've got limited time today, and each topic that we're discussing actually it demands its own webinar almost. The purpose of this is really to give you a snapshot of where we are, and then obviously the Q&A session is to dive deeper. But with that said, we've got a bit of ground to cover. So let's continue with the ECGT, which is in my eyes a funny abbreviation. It's the Empowering Consumers on the Green Transition regulation. And essentially what it means for apparel brands is you have to be much more vigorous and rigorous with the claims you are making when it comes to things like eco-friendliness or offsetting claims such as this product is carbon neutral. There's higher stakes or higher standards for what you actually have to do to be able to use these claims. Lewis, maybe you can elaborate on this second point, because I know that this is one that you're familiar with.
That's right, yeah. So if you're looking to make a general claim, so that would be things like eco-friendly, it would also be green, sustainable, responsible, any of those general claims, then what you need to do is either have your product approved under the EU eco-label scheme or a similar scheme like the Nordic Swan. There's only a short list that are kind of EU approved, or you need to immediately follow that general claim with a specific claim. So for example, if it's about the recycled content, then you immediately need to follow the word recycled with 50% recycled polyester, for example. So you can't have the general claim sitting in isolation. So those are your two options. Approved scheme for product or specific claim.
And I think one thing that Lewis and I talked about before this webinar is that you have to be careful with using perceived label badges, which is something that marketing likes to do, right? Adding, for example, a green leaf to the product just to indicate that there's some element of eco-friendliness. Those types of self-made badges, you have to be very careful about. So the why we've decided to, in this case, to include the plain penalty or the financial implication if you don't comply with this. This is the minimum set out by the EU that member states then have to translate into their own national regulations. So it's either 4% of your turnover in that specific country or a 2 million euros fine as a fallback if revenue is difficult to determine. Now the relevant deadlines here are, we've already passed the deadline on which the member states of the EU had to turn this into national regulations. So national transposition deadline essentially means the EU has given them the guideline or has given them the regulation, the directive, to then be converted into national law. And from the 27th of September this year, so this is really a date to mark in your calendars, these rules apply. And there's limited grace period for old stock. So it's actually very strict. Almost immediately, any existing stock will have to comply with this as well. Okay, so moving swiftly to the third regulation that we want to cover in the EU, which is the ESPR destruction ban. Now, I think one thing that we want to clarify right at the start for this one is who is actually in scope. And to understand that, we've visualized this here on the right side. So there's large firms, there's medium-sized firms, which you don't find here, and then there's small firms. So the reason we've done it like this is that it's actually easier to determine whether you are a small firm than trying to express whether you're a medium-sized firm. Medium-sized just means you're between these two thresholds. You are a large firm if you have more than 250 or more employees, or you have both more than 50 million euros in revenue and your balance sheet total is more than 43 million. You are a small firm if you have less than 50 employees and if you have less or equal to 10 million euros in revenue, or within that same bucket, your balance sheet total is less or equal to 10 million euros. And if you're somewhere in between, that's when you are a medium-sized firm. And what this regulation actually says is very straightforward. You just can't destroy unsold apparel anymore. You have to, if you want to do that, you have to justify it, and you have to keep record of that justification for up to 10 years. You have to publish any volumes of discarded goods yearly. And I'll jump to the next slide briefly just to show you how that looks like. So this is, don't worry, we have a more visual version of this, but this is from the EU itself, showing what exactly needs to be included in that reporting format. And if I move to the next slide, you can see we've broken this down into something that's a little bit easier to digest. So essentially it's, you have to include who you are naturally, but then the core part is really, you have to explain per category that you are destroying, why you have destroyed it, and you have to explain what is going to happen to that waste that's produced because of that. One thing that I personally find very interesting is that the EU also forces you to explain which measures you've taken to prevent that destruction. So if you decide to destroy something and then try to come up with a reason for why you've done that, it's a lot harder, obviously, than if you've actually already outlined that reasoning. You also have to include what planned measures you have in place to prevent any further destruction of goods. Lewis, because this is a pretty packed slide, anything we should emphasize, or do you think we've covered the key points?
To emphasize, if we go back to one slide, is that there's a very tight list sorry, back one more slide, very tight list of exemptions. So for example, if your clothing turns out to be unsafe, something like cords, but even if it has cords and those cords can be removed, then you still have to sell it. You can't discard the entire garment. This is really cracking down on those scenarios where brands are getting rid of products, particularly some of your big multinational brands that do this as part of their business model.
The bans apply from the 19th of July for large firms, and then from the 19th of July 2030, this also applies for medium-sized firms. Yeah, and with that, we're moving to number 2, which is the digital product passport. So the digital product passport is obviously one of the most discussed topics at the moment within the apparel space when it comes to compliance, just because it's around the corner and deadlines keep changing. The EU is actively making efforts to give out more precise guidance on what needs to be included, etc. Just a quick refresh on what we're talking about here. So the product passport is obviously fundamentally, in its simplest terms, a QR code that you add to your labels, and that QR code then leads the consumer to additional information about that product, such as materials, recycled content, origin, and more. We're going to get to that in more detail because we know it's one of the questions that was pre-submitted. Just on the timelines, which are probably the most important thing to know, we are essentially waiting for the Textile Delegated Act to come into effect. That is likely to happen in Q2 2027. The Textile Delegated Act is really the conversion of what the ESPR as an umbrella regulation sets out into the world of apparel. So the Textile Delegated Act will contain all the detailed information about what specifically apparel brands have to include on their QR code, or really behind that QR code when you scan it and when you're taken to some virtual to a web page on your website. Until then, one date that's interesting to know about is that in July, the central DPP registry is going to go live, which is the EU's way to slowly roll out all the infrastructure, the tech infrastructure that's needed to make this DPP possible. And with that in mind, you can see that things are becoming much more specific. Apparel brands and legislators have been talking about this for quite a while now, but we're really getting to the final stretch of the implementation of this regulation. Now, what to expect once the Textile Delegated Act is implemented is that it will then provide apparel brands with a certain number of months to actually implement these changes, or to implement the DPP. The Q4 2028 date you can see here is an estimate that people expect at this point. It could also be pushed out, but because the capturing all the data that's required for the DPP is quite the exercise, and it's difficult to do that all last minute. The most apparel brands that we speak to are already in process of collecting all that data. Lewis, conscious of the fact that we have more details on the exact contents of the digital product passport later, is there anything else you think we should cover at this point?
No, I think we'll touch on some of the detail later on, so nothing to add at the moment.
Well, I think maybe just lastly, understanding why legislators are so eager to get this over the line is really the digital product passport will allow you as a consumer, and even as a market regulator, maybe that's something you can add to, Lewis, to have much faster access to all this data that would otherwise just be hiding in one of your Google Drives or wherever you store that information. So it's really a step towards making sure that bad actors are being kept out.
Definitely. And just to add to that, so when I put my regulator hat on, part-time nowadays, if you think of a product, let's think of a different product like a cosmetic. When I'm looking at that in regulator mode, I'm looking at the labeling. cosmetics have to be registered on a database. So I'm checking that a product is on that database. And if I see anything, that's what makes me then delve deeper, to ask more questions and to ask for compliance paperwork. And the DPP is firmly putting clothing into that space, because at the moment, as a regulator, all I can do is look at a textile label. That doesn't tell me much. But soon, a regulator in the EU is going to be able to see a lot more information, including chemicals under REACH, whether they're in there or not in there. And so that exposes you much more to regulators spotting deeper non-compliances.
Lovely. So with that, we're going to our number one, and that is the packaging and packaging waste regulation. Callum, I'll pass over to you for this one.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Jonas said, in the EU, the new packaging and packaging waste regulation will be coming into force in August this year. So the scope of this regulation is pretty simple. It applies to all product types, all packaging types, and all packaging materials. And fundamentally, it includes a range of requirements going from things like caps on empty space in packaging to recycled content rules, labeling requirements, and harmful substances used in packaging. So it's underpinned by the EU's goal for all packaging on the market to be fully recyclable by 2030, and obviously has the intention of curbing the surge in packaging waste and move towards a circular economy. So as of August 12th, the first round of rules will apply, and a declaration of conformity is going to be required for the packaging. And we have a template that we could share with you of a DOC. And then post-August, there will be other rules coming into force, but wanted to just focus on the rules this year in August. If we just skip to the next slide, please, Jonas. Cheers. So ahead of the August date, these are the main questions you should be asking yourself and the main things you should be checking. So different things around size, materials, labeling, and administration documentation. We did run a much more in-depth session on this a few weeks ago, actually, specifically on the PPWR, and went into a lot more detail on this than we will here because, you know, we've only got a certain amount of time. That session was an hour in itself, but I'm happy to share more detail on this and more insights from that session for any of you who would find it useful after the session today. But Lewis, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to dive into in a bit more detail here on the PPWR.
I'll just call out a couple of things that I know of kind of tripping up some clients. So one is they're finding it difficult to get this information from their supplier because often their supplier is getting the packaging from elsewhere, as you can understand. So that's a conversation to start as soon as possible if you haven't already. Also to emphasize, this is the stickers. If the sticker on the swing tag has a coating, a waterproof coating, if it's attached with a plastic little, security tag, it's all aspects of the packaging like Callum mentioned. And the other thing that a lot of apparel brands aren't familiar with is the documents mentioned in the bottom right. So conformity assessment and declarations of conformity, they're normally associated with CE marked products like electricals and toys. So if you're not familiar with those, Callum can share templates and we can kind of guide you on that.
Okay, cool. And yeah, let's jump across the pond to, well, I'll take the lead here, Audrey, but we'll need your expertise to guide us. In North America, we've pinpointed 4 different regulations that we think are the most important ones. Let's start with the first one down in position 4, which is the Bill S211 about forced labor. And this is a Canadian regulation, just to point that out. So this is not a US regulation, this is a Canadian regulation. And it's about proving that within your supply chain, you don't have any forced labor. This applies to any company selling or importing to Canada. Here on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see who exactly is within scope. And as you can tell, the threshold is, well, rather high. You have to meet at least 2 of these conditions. So your revenue, your global revenue, maybe that's important to point out, not just in Canada, has to be above 40 million Canadian US dollars. I don't know what the exact conversion is, but I would assume that's maybe 30 million USD at the moment. And well, or you have the 20 million in assets condition. And that's why we put this in position 4, because especially for small and mid-sized apparel brands, this doesn't really apply. But for those that it applies to, let's briefly cover what's included. So the key deliverable that you have to worry about is really an annual report on anti-forced labor steps. And if you don't, there's fines up to, Canada is surprisingly and interestingly direct and clear about penalties. So it's simply 250K Canadian dollars. And I mean, yeah, Audrey, I'll pass the mic to you briefly for any comments you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, basically the conditions that you have to meet is probably going to exempt all, if not most of you in there. That doesn't mean that you're not taking those steps, though, to ensure that your supply chain is free of forced labor and child labor, because you also have the US UFLPA, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that is also in scope. The difference being is that the UFLPA is not a reporting rule, where in Canada it is a reporting rule. It's also a declaration rule. So like California's Transparency in Supply Chain Act, where you are supposed to provide this information to the end consumer via your website, Canada wants the same with this Bill 211. So if you are in scope, I would recommend, even if you're not in scope, it is an easy thing to do, assuming you've done your due diligence on your forced labor, to have a statement on your website. If you have like a sustainability, corporate responsibility button on your website, you'll want to put a statement in there that essentially says that, you know, you have scoured your supply chain and you are free of forced labor within that supply chain. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which actually takes you to the form that Canada requires for you to fill out if you wanted to take a look at that.
And in the meantime, just to give you an idea, this is the report that Everlane has on their website, for example. I mean, this one's a fairly old one already, but you can see this is a 15-page report. You can check it out for yourself. Most larger brands will have this corporate responsibility section, and you'll find some great inspiration there on how to structure it. Okay, next up is the textile EPR in North America, which is coming into force as usual, state by state, which makes it a bit difficult to track where things are. But textile EPR, what are we talking about here? Well, fundamentally, it's really you have to pay similar to the packaging EPR in Europe. And obviously, we also have a textile EPR in Europe, in France, for example. You have to pay for any waste that you produce. So if you sell textiles and apparel, then lawmakers consider that to be waste. And so in the US, this is catching on now as well, catching up with what's happening in Europe, where this has already been in effect for quite a long time. The state that's leading the pack here is California. California SB 707 is the specific regulation that enforces this, and you can see the deadlines that you have to that you should keep in mind down here. The key deadline that you should definitely mark in your calendars is that by July you must have joined the local pro, which is Land Bell, which is currently, I think, being challenged, Audrey. But at this point, it's still fair to say that Land Bell is where people have to register, right?
Yeah, Land Bell USA is specifically the textile pro that California has chosen. There's a Cycle Alliance, which is a different one that you use for the packaging. So you're doing two different pros there for depending on the chain that you're working on. It is important to know that the American Apparel and Footwear Association is suing the state of California and other states in their packaging for having this pro and using a pro instead of reporting directly to them. That does not say that you are not obligated to begin this reporting in July of 2026. You are, regardless. If that changes, then it will be a reporting direction that is being changed. At this time, it's $1,000 and you're filling out the form at this time, and that is an annual fee. Eventually, that fee will change to one that is based on the type of textile you have, so the recyclability of that textile. So, 100% cotton is going to be treated very different than 100% polyester. And then it will also be on volume based. But those won't come into effect probably until like 2030. So it's going to be a couple of years here before we see that. But right now it's $1,000 every year and you have to report.
And one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that there is a threshold for who this applies to. So you have to have at least $1 million in global revenue. But since this is a lower threshold, probably this applies to most companies here on the webinar. Yes, brilliant. So we have an overview of textile EPR deadlines across the US, which you can see here. So California, this is the only state where currently a textile EPR is live, has been adopted. In New York, Washington, Minnesota, something has been proposed. In Canada, Quebec is, I'm not sure if it's fair to say that Quebec is compliance-wise the California of Canada, but Quebec is considering a textile EPR, and that would then also make it required or mandatory if you want to sell to Canada. You can see that dates, and that's why we're not going to go into too much detail. Dates are in further down the line, and we expect that many of these dates will still change, just because as long as a law or a regulation or a bill is in proposal stage, obviously it's hard to predict when exactly it's being enforced. Cool. Let's move to PFAS restrictions in the US. So we've already covered PFAS for Europe. The US situation is somewhat different in the sense that the states are leading the regulatory regulatory direction. You can see California, New York, Washington, Minnesota are up. Maine or Minnesota, Audrey? What is it?
That's Minnesota.
Minnesota. They are leading the pack. I think I'll jump straight to this slide, not to go through it, but just to give you an idea of how much of a patchwork it is in the US. These are the PFAS ban deadlines across different states, and this is just the first of 3 slides. Again, this is just to give you an indication or a visualization of how this currently plays out. The focus, and maybe you can add some comments here, Audrey, the focus is across states on intentionally added PFAS, but in many states, they're also just taking a general look at TOF, total fluorine content. Yeah, if you want to add some thoughts to that, Audrey, that would be great.
Yeah, so it's what they're looking at right now is intentionally added, but California very specifically is or, regardless of whether it's intentionally added. So this can be any kind of contamination. Right now it's 100 ppm for total organic fluorine, and then that moves to 50 ppm beginning next year. So that's coming up in January. So it's 7 months away, right, at this point in time. So very, very close. The Washington State and New York are pending. Like it's going to happen, and they're going to be announced this year. But both of them, including a bunch of other states, ones that are not even listed on here, are going to be following California's model as far as the categories of products and how that is applied in these tests for the total organic fluorine being 100 to 50. They're all going to follow that same thing. Where it changes is that there are 3 routes that you need to be aware of for compliance, and they vary by state. And I apologize, we have no federal government oversight on this, really. They keep kicking the can down the road. So that's why states are picking this up and making this so extraordinarily complicated. There is bans and limits on the amount. There are reporting requirements for some states. So you have to go to that state government website and you have to create a report that shows either providing them test data or, your supply chain data, declarations, things like that. If it is intentionally added, you need to say why and exactly what one of the thousands of PFAS that are out there is in the product. And so you need to do that. The other one is a labeling. Labeling is kind of a stopgap measure that several states have put into effect, and it can cover general apparel. Mostly it's for severe wet apparel. So that's, professional and government. If you're going to do search and rescue, that severe wet level, probably not applicable to most of you. And the label is made with PFAS. So those are kind of the three, and they vary state by state. So, and it's constantly changing. Like what was required 2 months ago there's so many updates that happen, and it's happening very, very fast.
Obviously, this is one of the things that we'll share afterwards, just so that you have your snapshot of where things stand today. So you can go through this in more detail by yourself. Lovely. Let's move on to the top regulation to be aware of in Q2 2026, which is CPSC e-filing. And I'm going to pass over to you, Callum, for this one.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the main reason we put this first in the North American list is because it comes into force quite soon. But yeah, fundamentally, CPSC e-filing is a new method of filing compliance documentation online for any product tied to a CPSC regulation. So those that require a children's product certificate, that's a CPC there, or a general certificate of conformity, a GCC. So that includes wearing apparel and certain furniture and home items. The responsibility of registering the products is on US manufacturers, importers or the importer of record, and private label brands. It does get quite technical, and we did run a session on this last week or the week before, so we do have further guidance. But in essence, certificate data needs to be inserted into the CPSC product registry, electronically transmitted via a PGA message system into the US Customs and Border Protection's ACE system. As I said, it's quite technical, but essentially to clear customs, importers need to provide their customs broker with three things. So company ID, product ID, and unique version ID. If we just go back, Jonas, quickly.
Yeah, no problem.
As I said, this becomes fully mandatory in just a few weeks' time. So it's on July 8th of this year. Non-compliance risks shipments being held for inspection at the border, essentially. The system is currently active, so you can get working on this now, and any product data populated into the system will roll over when the deadline in July hits. And yeah, if we go back to the next slide, thanks. There's various methods of registering certificate data that, as I said, we went into previously, but fundamentally there's these three options for data entry. So kind of depending on how many SKUs you're looking to upload. So for less than 50 SKUs, we recommend manual entry. And then if you've got a group of SKUs between 50 and 500, we would recommend doing that through a CSV bulk upload. And then for anything more than 500 SKUs, it would be quicker and easier to do it with an API integration. Audrey, I don't know if you've got anything you would add here in terms of how you would recommend doing this.
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. I'm in the system, the CPSC product registry system for a couple of clients, and we have ones that have 100 SKUs relying on CSV upload. I have another one that we're currently working on API integration on, and that is pulling data from their ERP system. So basically just pulling data and into an Excel file, a CSV file, to then provide back to the product registry. So we're working on automating that. There are other companies as well that can help that software on demand if you need to take a look at that as well. But if your SKU count is low, you can probably do it yourself. It's time. It's it takes a lot of time to enter everything, but it's fairly intuitive and pretty easy on the system. The CPSC has been very good with providing information and making the system itself pretty easy to use.
Okay. And then, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, should we briefly talk about testing exemptions as well? Because I think that's always a something that confuses many apparel brands. There's we always talk about what products do GCC require GCCs and CPCs, and oftentimes apparel companies think they're exempt, but then we're talking about two different things because you still have to argue that you are just testing it. You still have to have a GCC. If you could just clarify that for us, Audrey, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there are these primary 6 fibers. If they are 100% entirely made of, and you see the list there of those fibers, or the plain fabric that has that density requirement on the fabric. Those are testing exemptions. Those are not certification exemptions. You still have to certify the product. You still have to create a GCC. You still have to enter your product into the system. But when you create that citation 1610, you then have to create an exemption within the system for that. And I believe we have a screenshot of how that works in the system. We can go over that, well, now or later, but yeah, whatever you want to do. It's pretty clear when you enter it in. But just to be clear, the testing exemption is not an exemption from certifying your product. You still have to certify it. Now, this is just for adult general apparel. For children's apparel, that's a full CPC. There is no exemption regardless, right? That exemption that is there is only for flammability. It doesn't actually exempt you in children's products for anything else that you're required. And that's the cords, the small parts, and all the other chemicals, phthalates, heavy metals, etc., that need to be a part of that testing for a children's product.
Cool. I would say let's wrap it up briefly, just putting in perspective what we've covered now, and then we can talk about the questions that have been pre-submitted. So bigger compliance picture, from our perspective, we always group compliance regulations into these 6 buckets: chemical, environmental, safety, social and supply chain, labels, and other. And you can see the dark pills, the black pills are the regulations that we've covered today. And obviously, these are the hottest topics at the moment. There's things happening across all other regulations as well. REACH is constantly being extended, not just with PFAS, but with other chemical substances as well. And the same applies to all these other buckets. But I hope this is helpful just to understand, if we zoom out a little bit, where we are, what we've talked about. Well, with this, I would say let's do questions and answers as much as we can.
Sure. Yeah, so we had quite a few questions, and I've kind of grouped these into subject matter. So just to kick off, we'll go, we had a question from Samantha, which I think, Audrey, probably is best for you to have a go at. But obviously, we looked at the North American PFAS changes, which were primarily US states we were looking at. But the question was around changes to Canadian requirements. Is there anything there that we should be aware of?
Not yet. So it is currently in process. So there is regulation that's going through in 2027, and that's really going to be focused on fire suppressant agents like foams, things like that have heavy PFAS content in them. So they're really focused on that for 2027. Within 2027, there is an expectation that they will finalize what they call phase 2, which will be more general consumer products and is likely to contain apparel and textiles, in which case that rulemaking will happen in 2027, but probably won't go into effect until 2028. So pending, but nothing as of yet.
Okay. Focus on the US for now. Canada will come later.
Yeah.
So, okay, perfect. And then the next one was around e-filing. So I think we had some material here to help with this one. But Louisa said that her product is exempt based on weight and fiber composition, but they don't know what an exemption certificate looks like or whether we need to test to prove it.
All right, so go to the slide.
Next, this one, you mean?
That's the one. All right, so what I did is I took a screenshot in the CPSC product registry that shows how you actually file a testing exemption for a GCC clothing apparel. Okay, so the first thing is you have to add the citation, and it is absolutely, you know, that you have to say that your clothing meets CFR 1610. Like you have to meet that, but you are exempt from testing it, right, for certain fabrics because they just inherently have a low flammability rate, right? So in order to do that, once you've entered the product information in, you can click the button at the bottom. I've circled that in blue, says add a testing exclusion after your citation's been added. And then you can add a search term there. 1610 is exactly what you want to do. And it gives you the drop down to enter in the exclusion. So your GCC will have all of the GCC information, have your information, contact information. It'll have the factory information. It'll have the location of production. Anything that you put into that CSV file is going to be transferred to that, that certificate. And then it'll have that this product is regulated by this standard, but it's also exempt here. So you need to have both on there, the citation and the exemption from the citation. And that's it. That's all that'll be on there. Once you've entered this information and you get to a point, you will have to add, if you have anything else that needs to be certified that you need to add, particularly for children's products, that will need to, additional citations will need to be added in there, and those will be on the CPC. Once you've hit certify for that, you will be given the option of downloading a PDF to do your GCC or your CPC. So it's done. You don't have to create a separate manual one like you're doing right now. The system itself will create one that you can use to have a copy of that. But other than that, the CPSC is not going to review those physical certificates anymore because all of the information is electronic.
Okay, perfect. That's really helpful, Audrey. And as I said earlier, we did run a session on this a couple of weeks back, so we have a lot of this material ready to go if anybody wants it to help them get through this. But the next question we had, again, Audrey, this will be for you, is from IGO. So, I mean, we've probably covered a bit of this already in the session, but she was asking about specific regulatory changes regarding children's wear, especially in the United States, as they're stricter. So I guess for a children's wear brand, what should be specifically top of mind for them?
So in most cases, when you talk about general apparel ban for PFAS, it's different for juvenile products, right? So you generally are already in scope for previously enacted PFAS bans for juvenile products, which should include children's apparel. So PFAS and e-filing, those really are the two biggest things. Now, there's other regulations that are going to be coming down the pipeline. I know they've been working on weighted blankets. I know that there is an infant wear standard that is currently being looked at, and that's swaddling blankets and, you know, like infant jammies that are kind of outside of what pajamas usually are on there. Those things are currently being worked on. The one thing that I can strongly recommend any apparel brand do is, if you want to really be on top of this, join ASTM. Join ASTM as a producer. It's, I think, $125 a year. It's really affordable for what you get. It allows you to be a part of those regulations. So you can kind of passively be involved, and then you will get this information ahead of time, or you can actively be involved and say, no, that shouldn't apply. And you can work within a working group to help create those standards. But I strongly recommend, if you want to get ahead of any of these things that are happening, labeling requirements, clothing, textiles, all that, join ASTM. That's probably the best thing you can do.
Well, there you go. Join ASTM. That's so the next question was from Bront, and either of you can answer this, I guess. But in terms of material and websites to be used, I mean, joining ASTM being one of them. But the question is around whether the regulatory body said that there will be any advice forums for all of these legislations. I'm sure many other people feel this way, but I find it very difficult to find accurate information on these topics. So it'd be great if, given they're mandating it, they offered some advice and accurate and accessible information. So I guess for either of you, what would be the big things that you would guide Bronte towards?
I can start on that. So the states is again patchwork. So there isn't any one place you can go to really kind of go and look at states. They will provide some information, but you have to go to each government website separately. Um, the sorry, the e-filing is a little bit different. They have a lot of information in what they call their document library. So if you look up e-filing document library, they have a ton of guidance. Again, they have been very proactive in working through the system, working with producers. They've been doing it essentially for 10 years. They've been working on the system. So it's still not perfect. It's still kind of strange in some ways, but they're very transparent about how it's going. So for the CPSC, absolutely lots of guidance. For the states, you need to either get somebody to help you out or you need to go to each place on your own.
And for Europe, I'm afraid it's similarly difficult. So if we talk about the EU primarily, the Europa website is the main website where the EU shares information about legislation and timelines and relevant documents. So if we're talking about digital product passports, I'd call out the Europa page called Implementing ESPR, and there's one called Sustainable and Circular Textiles, and we can share a link either in the chat or afterwards. If you want to try and see what's coming, then the EU has a website called Europarl, as in like Euro Parliament. And in there, there's a section for example, circular economy, and you can see the different legislation that's been approved or is being consulted on or is being proposed. So at least you can look out 2-3 years ahead. So that's the best advice I can give for the EU.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. The last bunch of questions we had were all around the DPP. So we had 4 questions on the DPP. So I guess firstly, most fundamentally, this is a question from Reese. What information is actually required for a company to be compliant with the DPP?
Kind of important, right? And you'd think the information would be readily available so people could start working on it. But because the textile DPP isn't being published until Q2 of 2027, which we know is only a year away, this isn't a finalized list. But I've gazed into my crystal ball, I've looked at different official sources and other kind of commentary, and these are the data points that I think are likely or very likely to form part of a DPP. Now, over on the right-hand side, the ones that we've grouped under impact and circularity, it's quite possible that the EU might take a phased approach. So they might have like a basic DPP that comes into force from day one, 2028-ish onwards. And then they might phase in the carbon footprint, water and energy use later, because I think it's unlikely that many businesses will be able to get to that level of data from day one. So think of that as like an advanced DPP, and that might be a couple of years behind. That's what my crystal ball is telling me. But we're talking about product identification. So that's things like SKU numbers, the GTIN, barcode type number, who's the manufacturer, the country of origin. And I think they're going to go to the level of not just where the final product was assembled. I think they're going to go 1 or 2 levels deeper. So was it dyed in a separate country? Was the yarn from a separate country? So you can expect multiple countries of origin if your product goes through different countries during the production process. Materials and safety, there's a few examples there. Happy to expand on any of them, but this is kind of the high level data points. What I will say is a couple of organizations that have done some work on this that are early adopters, they predicted there could be up to 126 data points that go into a textile DPP. So, and they've got that, and for example, under product ID, they've broken that down into SKU, size, color. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds. Lots of this you or your direct suppliers will have already, but lots will require you to ask more questions. So a key message here is start asking about this if you haven't already, because it will take some time to gather this information. 18 to 24 months is the typical time it's taken for early adopters, those who have tried to get ahead of the game, to get the level of information and engagement from their suppliers to get this information.
Okay, brilliant. And yeah, we have that document of the early adopter that we can share afterwards as well. And then on the DPP again, this is from Ruth. How strict do you realistically expect DPP enforcement to be in the first 2 to 3 years? Again, I presume you're having to consult your crystal ball here, but
I am. It is available for hire. But yeah, the first answer is we don't know for certain. But let me share the things that we do know, or that we think we know with a high level of confidence. So firstly, customs officers working at the border are expected, when this comes in, to not check the detail of the DPP, but to validate that the QR code has a corresponding record on that central register that Jonas mentioned earlier. And they can block products coming in at the border that don't. We do know that product regulators, so trading standards in the EU, basically, that they will check DPPs, particularly some of that regulatory and traceability, who's who in the supply chain information. We know that they can insist on compliance, or they can force you to withdraw a product from the market that's non-compliant. We know that financial penalties that are coming in will be effective, proportionate, and here's the key word, dissuasive. So financial penalties will always be worse than the cost of complying. Enforcement will sit with each EU member state. So we are going to see some variance, but we already know countries that have a pretty active track record around enforcement. I'm talking from being at TK Maxx, being on the other side of enforcement occasionally. Countries that look at lots of textile products like Poland. Countries that have quite a lot of eco-design enforcement are Netherlands, France, and Germany. So they're the countries that I would expect to see higher levels of enforcement. And I'm afraid that's all my crystal ball has given me so far, Callum.
That's sufficient for a crystal ball. More than sufficient, I would say.
I have remembered one other point, actually, which I think is key, and this isn't being spoken about much by other commentators, is that the DPP will need to be displayed on your website where you sell direct to consumer. And if you list on online marketplaces, they're being required to make sure that products have the DPP up front. So another risk isn't really the regulatory enforcement, it's the risk of your online marketplace listings being pulled if you haven't got a DPP registration. They might not check all the data points, but they will check that you have one. Similar to checking that you have an EU responsible person under the General Product Safety Regs when that came in. End of crystal. I'm aware we've only got 3 minutes left here, and people possibly have to jump at 3 o'clock, but we just have 2 questions left, both on the DPP, so we'll try and squeeze them in. So the first one was from Ella, specifically for accessories like bags. When does the DPP need to be in place? Is it the same as for other products? So it's not super clear. Again, until Q2 2027, we don't know for certain. The regulation says textiles, in particular garments and footwear. Mm-hmm. However, GS1, the company behind most barcodes, their interpretation is they don't think accessories are likely to be part of this first batch. Other commentators do think accessories, including leather accessories, will be in scope. So my advice, I think the person that asked, I think is from a bag company primarily. So my advice is still to start asking those questions. If you have a mixed product range of apparel and accessories, I'd start focusing on the apparel first.
Okay, perfect. And then finally, this question was from Amanda around the level of traceability. So what level of traceability is required for DPP?
Again, certain answer is still a bit TBC. My crystal ball is predicting at least 2 levels deep. So not just where your finished product was assembled, at least 1 level below that, which is where was the yarn from, where was it dyed, for example. Some predictions are it will go even deeper than that. So where are the raw materials from? One commentator said it's going to go 5 layers deep, which is where is the farm where the sheep were grazing and living their best life. We don't know for certain. I would say a couple of layers deep, probably.
Okay. Great. Well, that is the end of all of our pre-submitted questions. We do just have a minute left. So, I mean, if anybody has anything right now that they want to be covered off very quickly, then we can probably squeeze it in. But otherwise, I will be in touch with everybody afterwards to make sure that you guys got what you needed out of it. If there's any further information you want from us or any materials you want us to send over. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, everybody that joined us here. Thanks so much to Audrey and Lewis for giving us all their insights. And yeah, I'll be sending the recording. I'll be sending some additional information. And unless anybody has anything they want to ask, have we got anything in the chat? No. Perfect. Well, thank you, and I'll be in touch. Cheers, guys.
Thank you, guys.